Welcome in our ECO2Fuel podcast. My name is Clémence Contant. I'm the communications manager of Meta Group. We advise and lead exploitation and dissemination activities for EU-funded research projects in many sectors, such as renewable energy. In our previous episode, we discussed about renewable resources alternatives with CO2 conversion and biomass through two EU-funded projects, ECO2Fuel and BioFlexGen. One of the conclusions was the need to accelerate the industry adoption for those alternatives. But how to get there? In today's episode, we will focus on the role of European policy, specifically regarding the carbon capture and utilization, or as well known as CCU. CCU technologies capture carbon dioxide emissions and repurpose them into valuable products like fuels, chemicals, and building materials. This innovative approach offers a promising pathway to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while creating new economic opportunities. As we know, the European Union has set ambitious goals to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 with the Green Deal. This isn't just about environmental protection. It's about securing Europe's economic future and strengthening its global leadership on climate action. This means that we need to adopt new solutions in our energy consumptions and CO2 emissions. But that is not an easy task, particularly for industries requesting new systems, technologies, and new economic models. That is what Tudy Bernier will try to explain us today. Hello Tudy and welcome.
Hi, happy to be here.
You are Policy Director at CO2 Value Europe Association that is in charge of promoting CCU technologies on European level. Could you explain us what is exactly your role?
Yes, sure. So thanks again for the invitation. So I'm Policy Director in CO2 Value Europe, and my role is to follow EU legislations that are impacting carbon capture and utilization technologies. So as you were mentioning, CCU technologies is one of the ways to decrease emissions for a number of sectors in Europe. And what I'm doing on a daily basis is to analyze legislation and to engage with policymakers to exchange on those legislations to make sure that they are enabling for CC technologies to be scaled up, to deploy at European level. So in effect, what I'm doing is policy analysis, so understanding EU legislations, and advocacy. That means meeting with industry players, with NGOs, with EU officials, with elected officials to engage with them on what is CCU and why it can help to decrease CO2 emissions in Europe.
Okay. And could you please help our audience maybe to understand and give us a bit a basic notion of what is European policy? Because policy is a big word that we use a lot, a bit everywhere, right? But could you explain us in simple words what is the role of the policy and particularly at European level?
Absolutely, I can try. So the EU is very important for what are the legislations that are adopted, what are the objectives that are put in place, both at European level and in specific countries like France, Germany, Spain, Poland, all 27 EU countries. And so what is policy? It's essentially all those legislations, so objectives, for example, that are set at European level. So to make the link with our discussion today, the European Union is setting objectives or an horizon, and this is where European citizens as a whole need to go towards, let's say, and EU countries will implement those objectives, for example, through national legislations. Right now, what Europe is adopting, the new legislations that are in place, they're really crucial because they're regulating all parts of our lives, whether through regulating companies or regulating specific products and how they're made, putting in place specific objectives for reducing CO2 emissions. So on all kind of aspects of our daily lives, it's really what is being adopted at EU level that will matter. And it's particularly true for topics such as climate, environment, and energy.
Okay, thank you. And so what are these CCU technologies we're talking about that could bring a big change in our energy consumption?
So at CO2 Value Europe, we're representing the value chain for CCU technology. So when we say value chain, that's really throughout the entire, let's say, pathway for CCU, from companies that are emitting CO2 or producing CO2, companies that are capturing CO2, companies that are transporting that CO2, companies that are converting that CO2, and companies that are using CCU products. So what we're trying to do is to represent the entirety of that value chain. And as members, we have large companies, we have SMEs, we have startups, we have research organizations, we have university. And what we're trying to do is really to represent that complexity, that's the entirety of that value chain. And when you break it down, what is CCU? It's essentially about trying to reuse or to recycle CO2 that you've captured. You have different pathways for CCU. One of them, and this is what ECO2Fuel is about, one of those pathways is what we call CCU fuels. So essentially, you've captured CO2 and you combine it with, for example, renewable hydrogen that has been made from renewable electricity. And by combining that CO2 with renewable hydrogen, you get what is called a synthetic fuel or an e-fuel that you can then use as a drop-in solution. So that means today, in an industrial installation, in a plane, in a ship, you can replace what is used today, which is mostly oil, by those e-fuels. So that's one of the pathways. Another pathway is called CCU chemicals. So here the logic is the same. It's about using the captured CO2 as alternative feedstock to make daily products. So you can think about packaging, textiles, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals that today are being manufactured with fossil resources, so oil and gas, in certain cases using coal, and to replace that carbon feedstock with captured CO2. And that means maybe that's a notion that is important to have in mind. In the discussion, we very often talk about decarbonization because fossil fuels are contributing to climate change. So decarbonization is very important. But the other notion that we're trying to bring forward is the notion of defossilization. And what does defossilization mean? That means that we have a number of carbon-based products that we're using in our daily life. So I was mentioning textiles or packaging products, for example. Right now, they're coming from fossil resources. Defossilizing means that they're not coming from fossil resources anymore, so that they're coming from, for example, sustainable biomass or from recycling, so recycling a product, or from CCU. There's essentially three ways to defossilize, and that's the three that I just mentioned. So second pathway is CCU chemicals using captured CO2 as alternative feedstock to make sustainable products. Then a third pathway is storing CO2 in building materials. That's something that is known as mineralization, where you make, for example, industrial waste react with captured CO2, and then the CO2 is captured and stored permanently in those construction products. So that means that CCU is very different kind of pathways, very different applications as well, because as you can have in mind, the application for fuels would not be the same as for chemicals or for construction products. But what is behind the idea of CCU is let's capture and reuse CO2, so either directly from the stacks, directly from industrial installations, or from biogenic sources, so from sustainable biomass, or even directly from the air. There's a technology that is called direct air capture, where you capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere and to reuse that CO2. And the philosophy, let's say, behind CCU and all those pathways that I mentioned is really to try to move away from fossil resources. So we're using CCU as a way to have a feedstock that doesn't come from additional fossil resources that we pump from the ground. So I was mentioning oil and gas, for example, but to have this alternative, let's say, carbon feedstock that is much more sustainable. And that's really what CCU is about.
Okay, thank you. And so why do we need this CCU at the European level?
So one of the things that you have to have in mind is that CCU is recognized at international level, for example, in the IPCC 2022 mitigation report, where the IPCC is saying we need to do many things to mitigate climate change, but there are activities where it's hard to abate, where it's hard to reduce CO2 emissions. So for some activities, we know how to reduce emissions, but for others, they are called hard to abate or hard to electrify. And this is in particular for those activities that CCU can really make a difference. And why do we need it? Because, for example, to decrease emission from the shipping sector, from ships that are transporting goods, for example, it's very difficult to electrify those ships. And one of the solutions is to use those e-fuels that we were mentioning before. So, for example, you produce e-methanol. So that means that you use renewable electricity to make hydrogen, and then you combine this hydrogen with captured CO2. And that makes an e-fuel which is much more sustainable than the oil that is used today in the shipping industry. So you will always need a combination of options to reach, for example, climate targets at EU level. For example, electrification, deployment of renewable energy, use of low carbon energy, measures around sobriety, using less energy, for example. But one of the levers that will need to be used is CCU, and it will not be a silver bullet. It will not be the only technology that you need, but it will be one of those technologies that we will absolutely need in order to reach climate goals, because CCU enables you to decrease emissions, in particular from the sectors that are the hardest to abate, where it's the harder to decrease emissions.
Okay. So you already mentioned some sectors already with the maritime one, which is very hard to abate, for example, but could you also talk to us about other sector that could benefit from the CO2 conversion, and specifically maybe for the fuels, which is the case of ECO2Fuel?
Absolutely. So I was mentioning the shipping industry. That's really one that you can have in mind. Another obvious one is aviation, with the fact that it's in today's technologies, it's very difficult to electrify planes, or even to use hydrogen in plane, because you would need to change the entirety of your infrastructure, of the way that the plane is built and so on. And as I was mentioning before, CCU fuels, they're drop-in solutions. So that means that they can be used today without changing a lot of your engine, without changing a lot of your infrastructure. So that's the second one that we can think about. Another sector that is very important is the industry at large. Why? Because some of the activities, the most energy intensive ones, so for example in the cement sector or in the steel sector, it's very difficult to use electricity to reach very high level of temperatures, for example, for steel making activities. So the industry as such, the energy intensive industries, will really be one of the sectors that will require CCU fuels. Another one that you can have in mind is the chemical sector. I was mentioning before that essentially chemicals that are the building blocks for our daily products, for textiles, for packaging, for cosmetics, and so on, they're based on carbon. And so replacing that carbon that today comes from fossil resources with alternative carbon feedstocks, such as the one from CCU, it will be absolutely major for the chemical industry. Then if you look more broadly, there's many other sectors that could benefit from CCU as such. It depends on your choices and where you want to, let's say, put your focus. Typically, the transport sector, it could be one of the options, for example, to help decrease emissions for long-haul transport, so trucks, for example. So in theory, CCU could be applied to very, very different sectors, to very, very different situations. The question is, where do policymakers feel that it will have the most impact? And so right now, there's both legislations at EU level that look at the overall picture. So why do we need CCU as a whole? And then some specific sectoral provisions, legislations that are adopted in order for the CCU fuels, such as the one that ECO2Fuel is working on, so that they can be taken up by those sectors and used as alternatives to oil that is being used overwhelmingly today in those sectors.
Okay, and then could you give us an overview maybe of the European tendencies and policy about CO2 conversion that is coming for 2025?
Absolutely. So in the last years, the European Union has adopted what I would argue are unprecedented legislations around climate. You had a package, so it's like an array of legislations that were adopted in recent years that was called Fit for 55. The goal was to reach 55% of GHG emissions reduction in 2030 compared to 1990. So let's say an objective to reduce emissions by 55%. In this context, new legislations have been adopted around renewable energy, around the shipping sector, the aviation sector, around what is called the ETS, so that means carbon prices, the fact that company will need to pay more and more for CO2 that they emit, because the CO2 that they emit is contributing to climate change. And so in recent years, we really had a number of groundbreaking legislations that were adopted at EU level. And now the question at EU level is what comes next? So throughout 2024, we had the EU elections, and now you have a new mandate at EU level. So you have a new European Commission, a new European Parliament. If you want, it's kind of like a new government with new priorities. And this new mandate at EU level will need to deliver on those objectives and to continue to work towards those climate targets. And so what we're expecting in particular is that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, mentioned that there would be what is called a clean industrial deal that would be adopted at EU level. If you break it down, clean, industrial, and deal, that means legislation. What is meant with this is how can we bring together our ambitious climate goals together with, let's say, realistic and fit-for-purpose legislations for the industry to take them up and to make the right investments to move away from fossil resources and from fossil fuels. And so we're really expecting that the coming years are going to be crucial to try to bridge climate ambitions and providing the right signals, the right incentives for industries, for companies to make investments, for example, in CCU technologies, to make investments in renewable energies, to make investments in low carbon energies, and so on. The goal is really that it becomes, let's say, cheaper to go for the sustainable option, that it becomes more expensive, that it's more of a penalty to go like for the polluting solutions, and that it becomes part of the business case for companies, for industries to have to move towards the more sustainable options. And so right now, I would say that at EU level, we have the right targets, the right objectives. Now the question is, how do we deliver on those objectives? How do we give the tools and the incentives and the right signals for companies to move towards those ambitious climate goals?
Sure. And so you mentioned a lot about the industry uptake, of course, of these new technologies, but a part of the audience might also ask to itself, but as a citizen, how do I see this future impact? So from what we understand, it's not coming right away because there is still a bit path to go further. But in the end, it's our own consumption, citizen consumption, coming from the CCU. So what would be the benefits in the end for us as citizens?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one of the things to have in mind is that CCU is kind of like a nascent value chain. It's relatively new. Some of the technologies have been, let's say, maturing for years, but now it's really, let's say, an industry that can scale up and where the technologies are mature and so on. So it means that for now, as a citizen, if you go like to your local supermarket, it will be very hard to find like products made from CCU. But it's still a very important part of our collective, let's say, thinking to have in mind that we need to, let's say, to promote sustainable solutions, to work on what is the public perception, whether products that are made from CCU are going to be accepted by companies, accepted by consumers, accepted by citizens. And within CO2 Value Europe, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to make the bridge also between research, academia, and what is happening in companies and in industries to make that link between, okay, you have objectives, but is it delivering in practice? Do consumers agree with paying a bit more, for example, to have a CCU product rather than continuing business as usual by having plastics, for example, made from oil? So in the coming years, it will be a crucial point to work on this consumer acceptance and making people understand what that means. If your question is more concrete, as a consumer or as a citizen, what does it mean for you? It means that when you're going to buy, for example, packaging, you need to check like, okay, is there a label that tells me that packaging was recycled? Is there a label that tells me that this packaging was sustainably sourced. And in the future, we're hoping that there will be a label telling you this packaging has been made from captured CO2 and not from oil, essentially. So in that way, as citizens, in our opinion, it's very, very important that people learn about the issue, and we understand that it's a new issue and a complex one, but it will really, really be an important one. Maybe a final point that I can bring forward is that the question that you ask is also linked to, let's say, the broader discussion of, are we aware as citizens that moving away from fossil fuels, which is an absolute must if we want to mitigate climate change, it will come with choices. Sometimes it will come with costs. Sometimes it will come with let's say, strategic decisions to make. From our perspective in CO2 Value Europe, CCU, for example, it's also a way to decrease our dependency towards fossil resources, for example, from countries like Russia, from countries that are producing oil and gas and so on. So that's also something to make Europe more independent, more sovereign, to be, let's say, in control of its choices and so on. So as citizens, from where I'm standing, this is a very, very important point to understand. Right now, we're all very dependent on fossil resources, and that's what's kind of enabling our modern way of life. If we want to keep what is essential, if we want to keep like some of the parts of that modern life that are really, really important, we'll need to look at solutions. Sometimes that will come with costs, and we're aware that that's a difficult one in a context where you have inflation and so on. But that's something that citizens, in my opinion, need to reflect on. Like, when we say we want to move away from fossil fuels, and I think most of the political spectrum at EU level and in countries are saying we need to be less dependent to fossil fuels, it will come with, let's say, choices. And as citizens, we have to be engaged in that discussion to understand what that means. Will I pay more for example, taking a plane ticket because it's using sustainable fuels? Yes. Do I think that it's worth it? Yes or no? How can we adapt our legislations to make sure that fossil fuels are, let's say, more taxed, for example, than sustainable alternatives? All these elements are going to be very, very important in our collective discussions in the years ahead.
Thank you, Tudy. Yes, this seems very complex and still very European level, but do you know if there is also a need on national level? And because from the top we have European that gives us this guidance, of course, that's the start, but then how this is taken from the national politics?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, I mean, we always have to remember that what is being agreed on at EU level, it's not just like people in Brussels taking decisions, right? It's your government, my government, European governments that are also negotiating those legislations and adopting them. So wherever you live in Europe, your government is involved in all those discussions and is contributing and participating to adopting, for example, those ambitious climate goals. But where you're absolutely right is that at national level, you need to have an implementation of EU targets. Most of the time, EU legislations, they're setting a goal, and then it's for a national country to see how they want to attain these goals. So, for example, let's say, okay, you need to use more renewable energy, and then it's for country to see, okay, what are the mechanisms that I'm going to put in place to ensure that we use more renewable energy. So absolutely what is happening at national level is crucial. In the case of CCU, the one that we know the best in CO2 Value Europe, that means that national governments should adopt action plan, for example, to support projects that are manufacturing CCU products, that we should support research, for example, at national level, that we should have dedicated targets, for example, from moving away from fossil fuels and from fossil resources. One thing that I didn't mention a lot during our call is mineralization. So the building side, you can have at national level public procurement rules that are put in place to say, okay, we want to make going for the sustainable option, the easy option. And so you're absolutely right, Clémence, to say that the national level is very, very important. And that means national policymakers, local policymakers to own those issues and to put in place mechanisms that can help companies, that can help consumers, that can help citizens in getting involved and making those right investments, those right choices for a sustainable future.
Sure. And this is where, for example, ECO2Fuel project, which is a funded project, but is actually also acting locally on national level. Because, for example, in the project, we are having some demonstration sites involving local. So in this case, in Belgian companies, we have also German companies. And this is where national level, they can also be involved on European level. So this kind of project also, I guess, is part of this full process going further, right?
Yeah, absolutely,
so CCU technologies, from what we can conclude now to wrap up our discussion, is that CCU technologies are fundamental to move away from fossil fuels resources, and this is presented as a good, valuable alternative carbon feedstock, mostly for some sectors like maritime, as you suggested, or aviation, that need some independency in their resources, let's say from the state of the technology and where it goes, basically, where there is no direct fuel, let's say. So CO2 carbon capture can also offer alternatives in terms of resources barriers. Also from the perspective that you shared with us for 2025, so those will be crucial years coming up for the European policy level, because there is a conscious that is being developed lately. Even in CCU technologies, as we know, in comparison to wind or solar power, are very, very new technologies that are just coming up on the market. So let's hope for 2025, with a new government on European Commission level, that this new technology could go further with an industry adoption and further consumer adoption, as you mentioned it before. So thank you very much, Tudy, for your input and this large overview on this technology.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the invitation. Really happy to be exchanging with you on those issues, very, very important issues. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you to the CO2 Value Europe Association for participating. So if you want to know more about CO2 Value Europe Association activities and CCU technologies, I advise you to visit their website at CO2Value.eu. And waiting for our next ECO2Fuel episode, stay tuned on our social media, specifically on LinkedIn, where we are very active. Thank you and have a good listen.